Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Good morning. So many organizations are low on staff and high on stress. What can we do to support our workers and keep doing our important work? And what are the long-term solutions? Today, we're going to be joined by a leader from the childcare industry who is talking about some of these issues, and we're going to talk about both immediate and long-term solutions. This is Coffee Time with Masterminds, a 30-minute conversation with and for leaders of mission-based organizations. And if you're joining us, please let us know your name and where you are joining from in the comments. I'm Peta Blakely. I am the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting. And I'm joined by my co-host, Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth. Good morning, Cynthia.
Hi, Peta. Hi, everyone.
Rebecca is joining us in the background. She's acting as our producer today.
Yes.
Laura Perille is the president and CEO of Nurtury Early Education, a nonprofit childcare organization that serves over 1,000 greater Boston children and their families. She's made some tough choices over the last few months to be able to support her staff in this time. And she's ready to have a conversation about what it's going to take to keep getting our important work done. Good morning, Laura. How are you?
Good morning. Delighted to be here with both of you.
Thank you for joining us. So you made a decision to close an entire childcare center in order to support the staff better. Can you talk about what led to that decision?
Absolutely. Nurtury Early Education operates 5 early learning centers, or we did before the pandemic, and we also support a separate network of women-owned businesses providing childcare. But in our centers, which we staff ourselves, we noticed just incredible duress in the number of staff who were able to return to work, and our challenges in finding additional staff. And so what this meant for our families is that we had to shorten program hours, meaning that some people couldn't get childcare coverage for their entire shift or their workday. And we also had to close classrooms simply because we did not have enough staff. And then on any given day, given that we are in the middle of a public health emergency, one teacher calls out sick and we'd have to close another classroom. And so we came to the conclusion, and we did everything on the hiring front, offering signing bonuses and having a full-time recruiter and everything we could think of. And there was almost nobody out there to hire. And so we knew that that wasn't going to be sufficient and we had to look internally. And so that led us to decide that the best place to find highly qualified educators was within our own centers, and we were simply spread too thin. So we made the very tough decision to reduce our footprint, close one of our centers, and then did everything we could to incentivize those educators to move into the 4 other centers with retention bonuses. And then we raised the wages of the entire workforce by $1 an hour. And that combination allowed us to retain nearly every single educator from the closing center, and thus reopen classrooms, re-extend program hours, and staff more stably with a little bit of a cushion in those remaining centers. I believe, and I'd love to talk about it, that when we talk about supporting workers, particularly in childcare, wages need to be front and center, but how we staff and how supportively we staff and whether we give people time to plan and learn and breathe also matters. And so we could do that by concentrating into fewer locations. So we did.
I think that really matters. You know, part of the story that we hear less about is when organizations are short-staffed, it creates situations that are incredibly stressful for the staff that are there.
I think it's interesting, Laura, that you decided to shut down a center and get smaller, right? Sometimes that's a difficult decision for people to make, but when made strategically, it does two things. It can stabilize the organization, but also it can position you for growth in the future. Because if you run into, and so this is important for nonprofit leaders, right? When who have trouble letting go of programs, but when you're constantly focused on trying to fix something, right? And all these external factors are influencing your inability to do that, then you lose the time to focus on growth and strategic direction. So I loved hearing that, although saddened because it's had effects, but I think strategically it's going to turn out to be better in the long run, and it probably already is.
I do hope so. And one of the things that's interesting is while we reduced the number of locations, we actually have been able and will be able to put more children into care because we had closed classrooms in some of those other centers. So we're actually extending our size or positioning ourselves. But and we were able to transition about 3/4 of the families moved with us and moved into other nursery programs. About a quarter found others that fit them better geographically or otherwise. But you're right. It was making a choice to go smaller and even just leaving the impression that we were going smaller, and perception matters, right?
Yeah.
You know, for any mission driven nonprofit and for any service industry nonprofit, which Nurtury and other childcare programs are. And so we were taking a big risk, no question.
Yeah.
One of the other parts of the conversation is quality. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes when programs are struggling to staff appropriately, you know, the recipients and the families struggle in different ways. And so this was an interesting attempt to maintain quality, by retaining your staff, right? By maintaining the longevity of your staff. Even though it could lead to the perception, right, that you were serving fewer people or reducing your service.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we, I think earlier when we were chatting, one of you mentioned that what we used to think of as sort of crisis management was in the pandemic is now just our new way of operating. And together with some of my senior education leaders, we really wanted to make sure that we made space for the professional learning, for the focus on, continuing quality, that it was easy to lose sight of in the early emergency days of the pandemic. But if this is our new reality, we can't leave that by the wayside. So by consolidating and moving to a more stable staffing structure, we can invest in training. We can have teacher inquiry groups, which Nurtury had never done before. We can do some of those things simultaneously. And you can't do that if you have 2.2 teachers with 20 children and one calls out sick. You can do that if you have 3 teachers, and one can take a couple of hours to participate in a learning exercise. And so that is what really drove us. But for everyone in childcare, you can't balance your increased labor costs on the backs of families who can barely afford to pay for childcare. So that is the conundrum for childcare.
Yeah. Let's also talk about raising wages by, I think you said $1 an hour, because that is a big deal in our field, and must have really taken some significant thought and planning with respect to your budget and how you're running your organization.
It definitely did. And I'm grateful here in particular for the leadership and commitment of our board of directors. Like any mission-driven nonprofit, we have a board that helps lead us. And the senior team and the board felt strongly that there were a lot of one-time resources flowing into early education for the next 1 to 2 years in the relief and stimulus dollars. And there's always the sense in nonprofits that if it's one-time money, you shouldn't touch wages. And we just came to the conclusion that we had to use some of these funds as a bridge to what we hope will be a better funded early childcare system and go after direct wages. Nurtury already, as I said, had hiring bonuses. We have good, solid benefits. We regularly do a 3% cost of living increase, but the childcare wages are so low that 3% isn't enough. It's not enough to compete when the governor announces that lifeguards will get $20 an hour and you have early educators who aren't yet earning that. And so we felt we needed to go big on wages, and that's what led to the $1 an hour over and above our commitment to regular cost of living increases. But it's a risk, no question. We took a risk.
And let's talk about long term, because you said this is hopefully a bridge to a more permanent pay solution. What's the long term solution?
Well, I'm encouraged that there is a much more robust conversation happening. You see it in the media. We and other providers are certainly doing our part to advocate. It's in the federal, legislative conversation led by some of our own, delegation here from Massachusetts. When you look at the American Families Plan, talk about childcare as infrastructure, this is what needs to happen. And so the long term is that we need to consider two big things. Will the state consider early education a public good in funding the way we currently treat K-12 education? And specifically, will we increase the amount that is paid to support the most vulnerable children in childcare? And then will we as a society consider investing in early education beyond just the most vulnerable or highest need families? Because there are plenty of families who don't make the income eligible cutoff for subsidized childcare, but certainly can't afford market rate. And we worry very much about those families. So if that conversation continues at both the state and the federal legislative level, that would be the way forward.
But I think that that's so interesting and important that we just think of K-12 and education in a different category from early childhood education. And therefore that justifies that these workers are not earning a living wage, right? It's a pretty arbitrary cutoff when you think about the importance of early childhood education. And then we've talked about how lack of childcare is keeping everybody from going back to work. So this is pretty fundamental to a lot of our staffing problems or perceived hiring problems system-wide.
When you think about the 1 million women who have not returned to the workforce, there's no question that childcare has got to be one of the most significant drivers. When we first reopened, and remember, childcare reopened before almost everyone else. So we were fully reopened with our educators holding toddlers and babies in their arms in July of 2020. Right? Most public school systems did not reopen even partially until late fall or the following spring of 2021. Yet right. Early education was there. Nurtury operated an emergency center that we managed to reopen within 3 weeks of the original shutdown. So we even had a center operating in April and May and June before we reopened nearly all of our programs in July. And at that point, the largest number of teachers who did not return to childcare didn't return because they couldn't find care for their own school-age children.
Right. Yeah.
It's
last week we had Alicia Modestino on the show, and we were talking about perceived worker shortages. And she said some of the uncertainty about school is even worse than when schools were just closed for months on end. But right. Now children might go to school and then there's one COVID case and they're suddenly home, or they're home for 2 weeks. And it's very, very hard for carers to plan.
Yeah, I was astounded by the 1 million women out of the workforce, and how, I mean, this is just a vicious
Mhm.
domino effect.
Yeah, right. It is.
Where right the women cannot who are primary caretakers cannot go back to the workforce, and teachers as well as child care providers can't go back because there's no child care for their children. Like it
Right.
just continues and continues and continues. And so I'm sure there's a number for men as well. But because women tend to be the primary caretaker, we see that number really high. Um, Laura, you said a lot of interesting things, and I just want to circle back because I think your wisdom is extraordinary. This idea that your board took the risk of giving everyone a raise, and you are right. You said, boards tend to shy away from funding salaries when the funding that would take care of that is a one-time deal,
Right.
right? That is a real risk in nonprofits. What was that conversation like, though? Because I know EDs struggle in that area.
Well, it's a great question, and I will say I really credit the leading educators and the senior team at my colleagues at Nurtury, who we were just standing on our heads and waving our arms and legs to try and figure out how to address the staffing crisis, and just came to the conclusion that this is the way forward, and that the consolidation needed to be coupled with a significant pay increase for everyone, not just for the workers who were transitioning. They got an extra bonus, but everyone, who had been working. And so I think the real pivot was when we were able to demonstrate that, yes, there was a risk involved, but we were in such a crisis that we could not meet our mission, so that the bigger risk was right now. And I recall saying to them, this will raise a risk for us 2 years from now, but we may not meet our mission and be here if we don't address this now. So it is, it's sort of take the challenge on now or take the challenge on later. And we just decided we had to do it now, because we're losing workers all the time.
Yeah, there's a comment coming in. Laura, you bring up an excellent point. The childcare system is broken. Sometimes you end up like I did. I was working to work because I love it, but really working just to pay childcare. Oh my, do I know so many people in this predicament? I have a friend that spends $30,000 a year. She has a set of twins.
Yep.
And then another child under 3. And I was like, 30,000, like what do you have to make to pay 30,000 in childcare? It's a lot.
Well, and I so empathize with this viewer and the comment, because I can tell you right now that, in contrast again to K-12, the only real public funds that go into supporting early education and care are those targeted to the lowest income families. But the cutoff is so low and the regulations are so high that even that amount of money only reaches about 12% of the families who would be eligible based on income. And during the pandemic, it's down to about 9%. That's a minimal commitment. And when you couple that with the fact that you lose eligibility for subsidized childcare when you earn 85,000, which, think about that. If you earn 85,000 and let's say you are a parent with 2 children. So now you have a family of 3 on 85,000
In the city of Boston.
In the city of Boston.
You're not a wealthy family.
Who is going to be able to pay 30,000 or even 18,000 or even 10,000 of that just for childcare for 1 or 2 children? So as much as Nurtury's focus and mission is on the largely subsidized communities that we already serve, we're very worried about everyone who rolls off. So we call it the cliff effect.
Yeah.
You earn just enough. And I will say that two other salient points. One is that in early education and care, on average, both nationally and locally, the numbers are about between 30 and 40% of childcare workers who are eligible for subsidized housing, food, or childcare. Because while they are full-time workers, and the
so in a sense,
yeah,
we are subsidizing this industry without having a conversation about how we're subsidizing that industry.
Right. And we're subsidizing it on the backs of the largely working women who are early educators, and in Nurtury's case, substantially Black and brown women who show up every day, to care for children. That is the broken system that our viewer commented on.
I want to
sorry, go ahead.
add something. I'm having a moment when I used to work at a nonprofit and I would be in a meeting and I would throw just a crazy thought. And I'm so compelled to do that now. Why isn't this free? Why isn't childcare free? I mean, it would do so much to our economy.
It would do so much for our education system.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's also another conversation to be had, which is, should women really just be working to pay for childcare, or is maybe working good for them? And do they maybe have some right to work, right? That should be enabled with appropriate, safe, and affordable childcare.
Do they have the right to work? I love that. People always blow my mind.
And the right to access education pathways, advance their career, do all the things that, employment can be, besides a way to cover your bills and pay for childcare. For me, it really comes down to the question that we have a choice to make, and we have a choice to push our policymakers to make. Because you're right, Cynthia, there's no logic that says that K-12 education is fully funded, whether you earn $200,000, $100,000, or $50,000 a year. You have access to the same publicly funded education. And if your child is less than 5 years old, you don't.
Yeah.
And I think, if we had a whole nother show, we could go back to the historical roots, but it happened as recently as the 70s, when a choice was made to not promote fully funded early education and care because more mothers should be at home. Well, we know where we are right now, some 50 years later, and that has led to restricted choices that falls primarily on the backs of women.
One of the themes that we have talked about in multiple ways over and over on this show is individual solutions to structural problems.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think it came up first in an episode called I'm Mad About Self-Care, where I said that asking workers to care for themselves, to heal the effects of their jobs being incredibly stressful and under-resourced, was inappropriate. Like the job should also provide the care.
Right.
Was you able to do the job? And Laura, you're addressing some of that by saying, we, the organization, ideally we, the state, but in the short term, we, the organization, are going to absorb some of this stress and ensure that our staff are getting pay and getting other supports. I mean, you didn't just maintain, but you added things in a stressful time. This is a very different way of thinking about things, I think.
That is very reaffirming, because it is what we're trying to do. And you're right that we and other providers are struggling to do this within, the sort of box that we're trapped in, whether we rely on public subsidies or raise private money or have private pay families who also struggle. When you say private pay, that doesn't mean they're all wealthy. That means they're not eligible for subsidized care, and they have to pay for it on, by themselves. And so we swap stories all the time about, or strategies really. I'm in a support collaborative with, about 11 other childcare leaders, and we are constantly, communicating what we're doing and what might work for us, because it's hard out there, but the system does have to change.
I think we have a comment coming in.
Making the decision to leave your child in childcare is not an easy decision, especially for new parents. And if your child has differentiated learning needs, they may have no options for care at all. Laura, what do you recommend for parents of children who need additional support? Yeah, wow.
Yeah, you can
And that's
hear
not just young children. That is love. That could be loved ones at absolutely any age who need different kinds of support.
Yeah. So it's an incredible challenge, and I know that there are so many families seeking care who can't find it. And if they, but what I would say is, early education has a responsibility to try to meet the needs of all children with whatever learning challenges, barriers, and assets they bring into the center. And, at Nurtury, we think of that as the child and the family. But that said, on a practical basis, I think, public childcare centers that receive subsidies have an extra duty and responsibility to meet the needs of families. I also think family childcare can be an incredible resource. And a lot of people don't think about family childcare. At Nurtury, across the 1,000 families that we serve, nearly 2/3 of them are in our family childcare centers or programs. These are home-based small businesses. They are licensed. They're supported by Nurtury and in other systems and nonprofits. And they're very small. They're very personal. One of our particular strengths is that most of our family childcare homes are bilingual in Spanish and English. That just happens to be the profile of Nurtury's family childcare system. And while they may not seem like they have all the bells and whistles of systems, they can be very adaptive because they are small settings, generally 6 or no more than 10 children with either 1 or 2 educators. So I would encourage, just on a practical basis, that families look beyond the traditional centers and explore family childcare. It can also occasionally be a little more affordable and accessible, whether it is private pay or subsidized care.
And that's another bright spot from the pandemic, is that family members are coming together and supporting each other. And there are ways to get paid for that as well, right? So families come together, parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles can care for children, parents can work, and everybody contributes to the household. We've seen a lot of that as well. And I've spoken to a mortgage broker who said that part of this real estate peak is people are selling their smaller homes and buying bigger homes. One, they need to work from home, but two, families are coming together, right? And so that's a beautiful thing if you like your family.
Laura, you mentioned a learning community. And I think that there is an event coming up. I'm going to put a link in the comments. Do you want to say briefly what that event is?
That is great. Thank you for that. Yes. So on the morning of November 9th from 8:30 to 9:30, Nurtury Early Education is going to host a knowledge breakfast event focused on bridging the equity gaps in early education, and with a particular focus on the workforce challenges and staffing crisis. I'll be joined by one of my fellow Boston directors and a member of this collaborative, Assistant Speaker Congresswoman Catherine Clark will make remarks, and we'll just try and bring a little more depth, as you said, Peter, both to how Nurtury is responding to the staffing crisis, but position it in the broader issue area and the policy and advocacy that we all need to be engaged in if we're going to build a bridge to a better future for children and families.
But I think that in this crisis, there is such an opportunity to reimagine how we're thinking about care work and to stop pretending that it's invisible and that that when workers come to work, their care work has just ended for the day, right? Like they clock out of parenting, they clock out of that elder care and they go to the office. So now's the time. And I would encourage people to get involved and continue that conversation.
Great. Thank you.
Laura, this has been really interesting, really engaging, and given us all a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for making this a conversation and for inviting me. So great to be here.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. And
Have
thank
a
you
great
to our
weekend,
viewers.
everybody.
We'll see you next week. All right.
Have a great weekend.